Well, I think it should go very quickly. It's a hoax. It's a hoax. Everybody knows that. It's a complete hoax. The whole thing.
A political firestorm has erupted in Washington over one of the most controversial archives of the decade, the unredacted files tied to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. After millions of pages were released under a law signed last year, a select group of U.S. lawmakers have now been granted access to versions without heavy redactions, but only inside secure DOJ reading rooms. According to the report, that access has already sparked accusations of improper censorship and fresh scrutiny over how far transparency laws actually go. According to public reporting, the U.S. Department of Justice has begun allowing members of Congress to view unredacted versions of files related to Jeffrey Epstein, the financier convicted of sex offenses who died in 2019. This represents a major escalation in the long political battle over access to a sprawling set of documents often referred to in media as the Epstein files. In January 2026, the DOJ published more than 3.5 million pages of documents under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a federal law passed in late 2025 and signed by then-President Donald Trump that requires release of all unclassified material related to Epstein within a set time frame. While that publication marked a substantial milestone in disclosure, much of it was heavily redacted, obscuring key names and details. The recent shift letting lawmakers view the unedited versions inside Department of Justice facilities came after bipartisan pushback from members frustrated that the public release still contained extensive black markings. According to reports, access is limited. No electronic devices or copies are permitted, and lawmakers must review the files on DOJ computers and take handwritten notes. Representatives from both major parties, including Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, have touted the change as a victory for transparency. Yet this development also reveals a stark rift between the intent of the 2025 law and the practical limits of redaction policy, setting up the central tension of this documentary. The Epstein Files Transparency Act passed overwhelmingly in Congress in November 2025, with the House voting 427-4-1 and the Senate approving the bill by unanimous consent. Signed by President Trump, the law was designed to force the Department of Justice to publicly release all unclassified documents relating to Jeffrey Epstein's prosecutions and investigations. Under the statute, the Attorney General must make these files available in a searchable and downloadable format subject only to redactions necessary to protect privacy, ongoing investigations, and law enforcement interests. In practice, this process has been logistically daunting because the archive spans years of FBI and DOJ investigations, court filings, witness statements, emails, flight logs, photographs, and other materials collected over decades. Although the January 2026 release fulfilled the 30-day requirement under the law, congressional critics quickly complained the effort fell short of the statute's spirit because the majority of documents remain stamped with dense redactions. Reports indicate that some redactions were structural, concealing victims' names and identifying information, but lawmakers argued that excessive censorship went beyond statutory allowances and undermined public transparency. In response, the Department of Justice offered members of Congress controlled access to unedited files. That access is strictly regulated. Files can be read on DOJ computers in secure reading rooms, notes may be taken, but nothing can be electronically copied or disseminated. The tension here is procedural, not speculative. Lawmakers say they need the unredacted records to determine whether DOJ fulfilled the legal requirements and whether redactions conform to federal law. DOJ officials, for their part, emphasize the challenges of reviewing millions of pages and balancing transparency with constitutional and privacy obligations. At every step, the mechanics of redaction, what stays blacked out, what becomes visible, and who gets to see it define the contours of the conflict. The files themselves have no autonomous power unless someone can interpret them, and at the moment, that interpreter is Congress. What is unfolding in Washington is not merely about documents, but about the collision between legislative intent, executive implementation, and institutional limits. At the heart of this clash is the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law that President Trump signed last year requiring the release of all unclassified Epstein records in a searchable, unredacted format. The law's passage was itself bipartisan and overwhelming, indicating broad congressional frustration with prior piecemeal disclosures and redaction practices. Yet when the Justice Department executed the law in early 2026, the results were uneven. Millions of pages were published online, but key sections remained heavily censored. According to public reporting, lawmakers raised objections that the redactions were not consistent with the statute's language, and in some cases appeared to conceal information about influential figures rather than strictly protect privacy or ongoing investigations. This procedural tension exposed a deeper misalignment. The law empowered public release of files, but the executive branch retained significant discretion in how much to obscure. In essence, Congress tried to compel transparency, yet DOJ's implementation kept meaningful details obscured. Lawmakers then extracted an additional concession: access to the raw, unredacted versions within secure DOJ facilities. Here, the two institutions intersect awkwardly. Congress insists that unfiltered access is necessary to evaluate compliance with the law. The Department of Justice acknowledges the need to respect victims, protect privacy, and comply with legal constraints on certain records. According to reporting, lawmakers from both parties, such as Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, have used this access to spot redactions that they believe obscured material, potential wrongdoing, or statutory violations in prior releases. That alone has heightened the political stakes. Accusations that the executive branch mishandled or delayed the transparency mandated by law now reverberate across Capitol Hill. But the conflict goes beyond partisan rhetoric. The files being accessed do not themselves determine guilt or innocence. They simply contain records aggregated from decades of law enforcement investigations and legal proceedings. What lawmakers see or think they see is subject to interpretation, and interpretation is where political narratives thrive. Thus, the center of gravity shifts. The debate is no longer about whether something is concealed, but about why it was concealed, what that implies about institutional norms, and who gets to decide where the line between privacy and transparency lies. Critics of the DOJ's handling argue that delays and dense redactions undermine the statute's purpose, even while acknowledging the privacy and legal imperatives that shape every redaction decision. Supporters of the DOJ's approach emphasize that privacy protections and long-standing legal boundaries constrain what can be released. Meanwhile, the release itself has already sparked wider consequences. Victims' advocacy groups raised alarms about inadvertent exposure of identifying information, leading the DOJ to temporarily remove thousands of files. What is now clear is that access to unredacted files changes the political dynamic. Lawmakers are no longer reacting to third-party summaries or redacted fragments. They are confronting the source material directly. That is fueling new questions about whether the executive branch sufficiently honored congressional intent and whether institutional safeguards were strong enough to prevent excessive censorship. As access proliferates, pressure intensifies. The Court of Public Opinion, which has largely lived with fragments of the Epstein story for years, may soon get more fuel for scrutiny, but only after Congress completes its own review. In short, this battle is procedural, institutional, and interpretive, not evidentiary. It pits the legislative mandate against executive execution, with each step ratcheting up expectations and friction. And with millions of pages yet to be parsed by lawmakers and staff one document at a time, the outcome remains uncertain. This procedural clash over files is significant not because it revolves around salacious material, but because it reveals the fracture lines in American governance. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was intended as a corrective, a way to bring closure and accountability to a case that had been shrouded in secrecy and political allegations for years. What followed, a massive but heavily redacted publication of millions of pages, disappointed many observers who expected a clearer window into how federal institutions process the Epstein matter. This frustration is not purely partisan. Lawmakers from both sides argued that the DOJ's initial releases did not meet the statutory requirement for transparency, prompting the decision to allow unredacted access only in secure reading rooms. From the public's perspective, that is a far cry from public transparency. Millions of pages might be technically released, but almost none can be accessed in full without congressional oversight. Adding to this perception, reports of improperly redacted files that accidentally exposed victims' identities led to further criticism and episodic removals by the DOJ. This sequence highlights a fundamental tension between the public's demand for openness and the legal processes that govern sensitive information. Transparency laws exist, but so do privacy protections and prosecutorial discretion. The intersection of these two principles inevitably creates friction and confusion. As congressional review continues, institutional trust is strained in several ways. The public sees millions of pages, yet cannot download or search the raw, unedited content. Lawmakers' elected representatives must still act as gatekeepers, reinforcing a sense that transparency is conditional rather than absolute. Executive agencies must balance legal constraints with statutory intent, creating interpretations that cannot satisfy all stakeholders. Ultimately, these procedural gridlocks feed a broader mistrust in institutions. When laws are passed to force disclosure but then implemented in ways that dilute or delay visibility, public confidence erodes, not because institutions are illegitimate, but because the mechanisms of disclosure expose their limits. With access to unredacted files now underway, the question shifts to what comes next and who benefits from the tussle over transparency. For Congress, unfiltered access places lawmakers in the driver's seat of interpretation. Members can now determine whether the Justice Department's initial redactions were consistent with the law or protective to a fault. They can also pursue additional oversight hearings and subpoenas to clarify unresolved questions arising from the unedited records. For the Department of Justice, the challenge remains balancing statutory transparency with constitutional and privacy constraints. Defensive posture on redactions doesn't eliminate criticism, but it reflects the legal limits the agency faces when dealing with extensive archives involving victims, ongoing investigations, and confidential sources. At the intersection of these forces, public expectations will continue to outpace what institutions can deliver without undermining legal protections or personal privacy. The friction between transparency and obligation is not unique to this case, but becomes visible because of the scale of the files and the public interest involved. This episode underscores a larger lesson. Transparency laws do not guarantee unfiltered access. They create frameworks within which complex legal judgments must still be made. Whether one sees this as a flaw or an unavoidable tension depends on one's view of institutional roles, but the pressure points exposed here are real. There is no definitive resolution yet. The unredacted access granted to Congress opens new avenues for scrutiny, but the files themselves are not a panacea. They are a reminder that institutional checks and balances and the public's faith in them depend as much on implementation as on the laws themselves.